If someone at some point finds this suit and pulls the voice files, they'll hear this. My name is Daniel Correia. I'm 34 years old, behavioral biologist specializing in extreme environments. I've worked for NASA for 7 years studying how organisms react when the place wasn't made for them. Now I'm discovering what it's like to be the organism. I'm in an enclosed space. The word room seems too small. Chamber seems too large. It's a perfect circle approximately 8 meters in diameter. Uniform floor, no cracks, no visible seams. Smooth curved walls, no corners to really lean against. Up above, a translucent dome lets in constant white light. It doesn't come from a sun. It's as if the material itself emitted brightness, never changing. There are no hours in here. There's just lit, and slightly less lit. The suit is still intact. Oxygen stable at 21%, temperature controlled at 19 degrees Celsius, normal pressure. If someone just looks at the data, they'll think everything's fine. It's not. The problem isn't the air. It isn't radiation. It isn't temperature. It's the context. I know I'm no longer on the ship. I know I'm also not in the vacuum of space. And I know, with an uncomfortable certainty, that I'm not alone, even without seeing anyone. Sometimes, up high, behind the dome, a shadow passes. Too fast to take shape, too slow to be reflection. Every so often, the floor changes sensation, as if testing my weight with surgical precision. And at some moments, the light in here adjusts in a very specific way, like someone looking for the best angle for a photograph. There's no voice, no message, no text on the walls. But there's an intention so clear that I don't need language to understand. They placed me in a place where everything was designed to observe me better. And it's from here, sitting on the floor of this perfectly neutral enclosure, that I'm going to tell how a NASA team left Earth to study an interstellar body and ended up becoming part of a collection. Someone's collection. If this recording reaches anywhere, at any time, understand one thing from the beginning. We didn't come here to rescue anything, not to save the world, not to be heroes. We came to observe, and we discovered too late that we were the observed. To explain properly, I need to go back, before the ship, before the object, to when this was all just a conference room meeting with lukewarm coffee and a strange dot on a screen. When they first showed S-59, there was no dramatic music, no movie speech. It was an ordinary morning at the NASA building in Houston. Rectangular room, projector on, too many graphs on the screen. I sat in the middle of the table with a cup of cold coffee in my hand and tried to understand why they'd called specifically us. S-59 appeared on the big screen as a bright line against a black background. A dark, elongated body coming from outside the solar system. Strange orbit, strange velocity, reflection too strange for common rock. Nobody used the word alien. You don't say that out loud in a building full of people who put equations on walls. But the entire room thought the same thing. A body that wasn't born here. That crossed the space between stars and decided to decelerate near us. The presenter, one of the orbital dynamics engineers, pointed to the graph and explained that the object didn't follow expected behavior for common asteroids. Talked about irregular entry angle, rotation variation inconsistent with natural body, and ended with the phrase that really mattered. It's not simply passing through, it's remaining. That's why I was there. On the team, there were 4 of us. Enrique Alves, 38 years old, systems engineering. The guy who makes everything work and who doubts any number that's too pretty. Had already flown 3 previous missions and had that calm manner of someone who's seen a lot go wrong in space. Luana Ferreira, 32 years old, geology and materials. Capable of spending an entire night looking at a rock without noticing time passing. Had triple doctorate and photographic memory for chemical compositions. Miguel Santos, 41 years old, doctor. Too calm for someone who'd seen so much in emergency rooms and orbital laboratories. Specialist in extreme environment physiology. And me, responsible for behavior and biology in confined spaces. My job was to understand how the human mind reacts when the environment becomes hostile in ways that don't involve lack of air or radiation. We weren't friends. We were professionals used to functioning near the limit. After the presentation, the discussion was contained. No shouting, no movie-style excitement. Henrique questioned the rotation data with mathematical precision. Luana wanted to know about estimated composition based on reflection spectrum. Miguel asked about mission duration and preventive medical routines. I stayed quiet. What bothered me wasn't what we knew. It was the too calm way everyone seemed to accept what we didn't know. The mission, on paper, was simple. Reach S-59, dock safely, collect surface data, identify if it was natural body, fragment of something larger, or constructed structure. No cinematic landing, no flag, no first steps. Just approach, docking, and systematic study. Behind the protocol, the subtext was clear. If that was just a rock, it would become one more scientific publication. If it was something else, nobody had a plan B written on slides. The days before launch were a pile of medical exams, docking simulations, and short hallway meetings. The ship wasn't latest generation, but it also wasn't old. A reliable platform called Meridian 7, adapted for approaching objects in natural trajectory. Inside it, there was nothing romantic. Cramped command module, 4 meters by 6, 4 built-in bunks, a minimal kitchen with pre-processed food warmer, and an equipment area that smelled like new metal and heated plastic. The type of place where you know you'll spend too much time with the same people, breathing the same recycled air, thinking the same things. The night before launch, we did the complete final medical check. Miguel went through each of us with his usual calm, measuring blood pressure, heartbeats, neurological reflexes. He commented, in neutral tone, that all 4 were healthy, stable, ready for protocol. On my turn, while adjusting the cuff on my arm, he asked if I'd flown before. I answered not like this. That my maximum limit had been simulation chamber and closed laboratory without window for 6 months in terrestrial training. He nodded, as if mentally registering. Said, with that almost clinical manner, that space didn't forgive excess confidence or excess fear, that the best thing was to stay in the middle. I'd be happy if the problem had been just fear or confidence. What destroyed us was something else. It was the feeling that we were entering a situation where we weren't the only ones asking questions. The launch happened as all reports describe. A sequence of growing vibrations, pressures that deform the face, and checks too fast to fit in any conscious narration. When we finally left Earth's atmosphere, and the sensation of weight returned to the artificial normal of rotational gravity, Earth stayed behind like a distant blue disk in the main viewport. Henrique dove into trajectory numbers. Luana locked her gaze on the approach prediction. Miguel observed us more than he looked at outer space. I stayed at the side window, the smallest, least important one, looking at the void where S-59 was still just a mathematical point waiting to become real image. At that moment, it was still easy to believe that in the end, everything would be explained with physics, statistics, and a bit of luck. The idea that someone could have deliberately built an object that size, with that calculated trajectory, was too uncomfortable to share out loud, so it stayed there inside my head, quiet, waiting for the right moment to become impossible to ignore. The approach took 7 Earth days. In that time, S-59 stopped being just a number on the navigation panel and became a real body in Meridian 7's front viewport. First, it was a luminous point against the black. Then, an elongated line reflecting distant solar light. Later, a defined 3-dimensional shape. On the main high-resolution screen, it looked like a dark block in slow and precise rotation. No visible crater, no evident relief, no irregular brightness, almost polished. Henrique commented, in neutral tone, that rotation was too good for the type of object they said it was. The angular velocity was exactly 3 degrees per minute, too perfect to be a result of random collisions. Luana redid the orbit calculations on her own, as if she could find an error the size of a planet hidden in a decimal place. She didn't find one. Miguel observed our vital signs and sleep history on the medical panel, as if he sensed the problem would be more with us than with space. On my side, the discomfort grew without valid technical excuse. Natural objects carry history on the surface. Impact marks, thermal cracks, gravitational asymmetries. S-59, as we got closer, seemed to have been cleaned of history. No cosmic dust adhered. No loose fragment floating nearby. No brightness variation that betrayed microscopic texture. Just that uniform darkness. A single piece. Too fat to be conventional ship. Too organized to be space rock. When Meridian 7 entered the final phase of approach maneuver, the retro rockets worked exactly as in terrestrial simulation. Nothing deviated from predicted. Nothing shook above parameters. No superfluous alarm beeped. It was Henrique who noticed first, with contained technical irritation. Said the object was slightly adjusting its own rotation. Said that if it had maintained the old recorded parameters, we would have spent 17% more fuel to match docking axis. Instead, it seemed it had made minimal effort to facilitate our approach. It wasn't much, just 2.3 degrees of adjustment. But in space, a few degrees don't happen by nature's goodwill. Luana analyzed the spectrographic data again. Concluded there was no simple explanation within rocky body physics, and left the comment suspended in the air, as every scientist does when they prefer not to use the word impossible. Miguel noted the fact as someone notes clinical symptom to be reviewed later. I thought about something I didn't write in the official report. The sensation that we weren't arriving at a neutral place. We were being received. The docking was silent. Outside the ship, no apparent joint, no visible coupling on S-59's surface. In telemetry, everything clean. When Meridian 7 touched the object, there was no clear shock or mechanical jolt. The sensation was closer to controlled support. As if we'd landed on a slightly malleable surface that adjusted to our shape. Henrique ran a gloved hand over the internal structure of the hatch, already fully suited, as if he could feel through the thermal insulation layers what the external sensors were registering. The material didn't behave like known metal. Not like silicate rock. Not like cataloged synthetic compound. The density reading was inconsistent. Varied between 2.1 and 4.7 grams per cubic centimeter depending on measurement point. Luana saw the same impossible pattern in the spectrographic numbers. Surface temperature was low, -142 degrees Celsius, but not extreme for object exposed to vacuum. There was no measurable thermal variation between regions. No colder point indicating permanent shadow. No hotter point suggesting internal source. Nothing detectable emission of ionized particles. Nothing that seemed like active radiation in any known spectrum. It was too neutral. A physical zero that didn't match the fact of being there, so well positioned in stable orbit. Miguel checked our biometric indicators one last time before exit. All 4 of us had elevated heart rates, between 85 and 92, but stable. Blood pressure slightly high, but within acceptable for controlled stress situation. Describing this part seems simple in technical report. But there was a discomfort that didn't fit in standard scientific vocabulary. The team, which knew mechanical failures, system noises, and false alarms well, began to deal with the opposite. A too perfect silence. Frictionless functioning, and perfect functioning, in genuinely unknown environment, isn't usually good news. The transition from ship to S-59 surface was recorded on all onboard sensors. We exited through the external hatch in single file, as exploration protocol dictates. The first direct view of the surface wasn't dramatic. There was no alien mountain, no impressive crater, no cinematic science fiction landscape. What there was a uniform extension of dark gray material, with a discrete, almost metallic shine. No apparent texture even at maximum visor magnification. When my suit's foot touched that for the first time, there was no dull sound of hitting rigid metal transmitted by vibration. Not the slight slide of contact with rock covered in frozen dust. What there was a slight give, maybe 2 millimeters, followed by perfect return to original position without residual oscillation. As if we'd stepped on a structure that accepted distributed weight, but didn't permanently deform it. Henrique tested 3 calculated steps, each separated by exactly 1 meter, constantly watching the suit's HUD. Contact pressure readings showed minimal variation between 67 and 71 kilopascals. No sign of structural instability. He commented over internal radio that the tactile sensation was of walking on something that imitated solid surface, without being exactly soil in geological sense. Luana crouched carefully and brought portable chemical analysis sensors close. The microscopic sample she managed to scrape with the diamond tool didn't behave like loose mineral fragment. Broke into 2 clean geometric forms, almost perfect cubes with 90-degree edges. Composition graphs indicated known elements, carbon, silicon, titanium, but in proportions that didn't correspond to any cataloged mineral. And there were traces of something the spectrometer couldn't identify. Just marked as unknown element, with estimated atomic mass of 243. Miguel, positioned 3 meters back for safety, observed our movements and the floor's response pattern through the suit's cameras. Recorded everything methodically. I tried to pay attention to the entire body of the object as we walked. Looked to the sides, searching for joints, welds, seams, anything that indicated construction by assembly. Saw nothing. No material alteration visible. No union line. Nothing that seemed like addition or later modification. It was a continuous piece approximately 2 kilometers long by 400 meters wide. A mold on absurd scale. The word that came to mind was hull. And I didn't like the word. Hull implies something underneath, something protected, something hidden. We walked approximately 60 meters from Meridian 7's hatch, always maintaining direct line of sight to each other. Basic protocol for exploration in unknown environment. The sky out there was the same as deep space. Absolute black with distant points of light representing stars. No planet visible as colored sphere. No large nearby star in direct field of vision. Just cosmic vastness. And that silent and impossible body under our feet. That's when Henrique saw the first opening. He stopped abruptly and raised his left hand. Visual signal for attention, anomaly detected. It wasn't a door in conventional terrestrial sense. It had no structural frame, mechanical hinge, or visible gap between plates. It was an oval region of the surface, approximately 3 meters tall by 1.8 wide, where the material seemed less opaque, as if it were thinned. In reflected distant solar light, it resembled a condensation mark on dark glass. Henrique approached with extreme caution, constantly checking radiation, magnetic field, and atmospheric composition indicators. The material in that region reacted differently to sensors, didn't change temperature, remained at the same -142 degrees, didn't emit detectable radiation at any frequency. But proximity sensors showed some form of weak electromagnetic field, extremely stable at 23 milligauss. Luana suggested over radio it could be a natural flaw in the structure, an imperfection in the geological process, or whatever it was, that formed the body. She herself sounded visibly unconvinced of her own hypothesis. Miguel pointed out that if it were a random flaw, it shouldn't be positioned at exactly 30 degrees from our docking point. Location too precise to be statistical coincidence. We had no technical proof that was an invitation. But in scientific exploration, Many decisive movements begin with poorly formed hypotheses and a lot of accumulated instinct. At a certain distance, Henrique estimated 2 meters. The surface inside the oval outline began to visibly change. Didn't swing open like mechanical door. Didn't tear like fabric. Didn't retract in articulated layers. It became progressively more translucent. Little by little, in a process that lasted exactly 17 seconds according to the HUD chronometer, until it became a kind of almost transparent membrane with visual thickness of maybe 5 centimeters. Henrique's sensors marked discrete adjustment of internal pressure, rose from absolute 0 to approximately 2.3 kilopascals. Nothing dangerous, nothing dramatic, just precise environmental control. And then that translucent membrane simply ceased to exist, didn't evaporate, didn't melt, didn't fragment into pieces, disappeared. What remained was an opening into the structure's interior, dark in the first second, then gradually bathed in clear and uniform light. That didn't come from any specific visible point source. An illuminated internal space, waiting. Henrique recorded the event with the cold objectivity of technical manual, but audible breathing on the radio became visibly faster, rose from 14 breaths per minute to 23. Luana checked the atmosphere inside using long-range remote sensor. Low pressure, 4.1 kilopascals. Composition, mostly nitrogen with traces of argon. Nothing breathable for human without suit. Nothing hostile or corrosive. Inert and neutral numbers. Miguel reviewed our own biometric indicators one last time. Elevated but controlled heart rates, between 95 and 108. Suit oxygen at 100%. Stable internal temperature. Everything technically in order for progression. I looked into that corridor illuminated without apparent source, with floor of the same external material and smooth walls without any mark. I thought that everything there seemed to have been carefully planned to not give us any obvious clue about function or origin. No clear and immediate danger, no comfort or welcome. Just a geometrically perfect path. Waiting. And that's how we entered. Into a structure we didn't know to call spaceship or orbital station or natural body. But that, looking now from inside the circular enclosure where I'm trapped for I don't know how long anymore, I can only technically describe as something else, an environment built with purpose. And built environments, unlike floating space rocks, always have specific function. The initial corridor was 2.4 meters wide, narrow enough to force alignment in single file, but wide enough to not inspire immediate claustrophobia. It was a subtle psychological balance. If narrower, it would inspire instinctive panic. If wider, it would suggest false sense of security. There, we stayed just constantly alert. The wall material wasn't exactly smooth or rough. It had an almost imperceptible intermediate texture that gave the strange impression of absorbing gaze. As if light wasn't being reflected back normally, but being consumed and returned in the same tone without specular shine. There was no defined light source. No visible lamp, no LED panel, no clear emission point. The place simply possessed ambient light, as if each surface were a microscopic diffuse emitter of neutral white clarity. Henrique, at the front of the line, recorded everything in low voice for the onboard recording system connected via radio to Meridian 7. Nothing personal opinion or speculation, just objective measurements, atmospheric pressure rising gradually. Now at 6.7 kilopascals. Temperature increasing, minus 83 degrees. Stable chemical composition, minimal magnetic field variation. All technically neutral and non-threatening numbers. Luana observed the floor with the almost religious attention that planetary geologists reserve for rocks that tell billions of years of history. But there was no sedimentary history there. No depositional layers, no erosion or weathering. Just clear, constructive intention. Miguel analyzed mainly us, not the surrounding environment. It was easy to tell when an experienced doctor is worried about the patient, even when the patient doesn't yet know there's clinical reason for concern. I stayed slightly further back, trying to understand the architectural behavior of the place. Not in purely technical terms, Henrique already covered that perfectly, but in functional and behavioral terms. Environments built by intelligence always carry clear spatial priorities: movement flow, access hierarchy, psychological orientation. That corridor didn't exactly invite us to explore freely. It conducted us. There was fundamental difference. We walked approximately 40 meters in perfect straight line. The corridor didn't curve, didn't deviate, didn't present any irregularity. Then, we reached the first spatial widening. It was an oval widening in the corridor, as if space had expanded laterally. Wider walls, now with 4.2 meters of separation. Higher ceiling, rose from 2.8 to approximately 4 meters. But without forming complete closed room. It was transitional. The change was minimal in purely physical and geometric sense, but enormous in psychological sense. There, for the first time since we entered, we could turn 180 degrees and look at each other face to face, without needing to walk in restrictive single file. It seemed extremely intentional. Sufficient size to socially reorganize the group and visually record that. Like a medical triage room, Henrique did what methodically trained people do when facing the genuinely unknown. Tried to predict the structure's next behavior through patterns. Pressed gloved palm against nearest wall. The material was cold, minus 79 degrees according to suit's thermal sensor, but not frigid as it should be. No sign of structural vibration, no detectable pulse, completely inert. Luana tested the floor with portable density sensor. Reading confirmed what we already knew, but that was getting progressively more disturbing. It wasn't natural rock, not molten metal, not familiar terrestrial industrial compound. It was something that behaved mechanically like rigid solid, but with recoverable molecular elasticity impossible for known inert materials. Miguel said nothing verbally, just checked with clinical efficiency the total exposure time. 32 minutes since we left Meridian 7, and accumulated oxygen consumption of all 4 suits. Everything within safe parameters. It was a more human and preventive gesture than purely technical. I tried to functionally imagine the true reason for that specific space. In terrestrial scientific installations, proportionally wider areas right at the beginning of a path usually serve for behavioral triage, where transported equipment is visually checked, where group behavior is observed from distance, where social grouping is confirmed before progression. At that specific moment, I really didn't want to consciously think about triage, but it was increasingly difficult intellectually to avoid the word. We left the widening and continued down the corridor. Now it subtly changed, lost perfect linearity. After 18 meters, it divided into 3 branches, all visually identical in width, height, and lighting. Henrique instinctively consulted the 3-dimensional map on the suit's HUD. There was no map. Meridian 7 hadn't been able to scan the interior through the external hull. Just emptiness in the data. Luana suggested each corridor could lead to a functionally specific destination, dividing sectors by specialization. Technically sensible comment, almost innocent. Miguel pondered quietly that the place was perhaps deliberately testing our capacity to deal with spatial ambiguity. Architectural ambiguity is a powerful behavioral trigger in social organisms. Forces rapid group consensus, or exposes internal discord. I thought something simpler and more direct. Someone, or something, wanted to actively observe what we would choose when confronted with equivalent options. Henrique marked relative orientation using the suit's magnetic compass and made decision. We followed the central corridor, maintaining symmetry. After maybe 12 additional meters, the light quality visibly changed. Didn't darken. Didn't increase in intensity. Changed color temperature. Instead of that uniform cold neutral white, it gained a slightly yellowish and warmer tone. like old laboratory light with incandescent lamps. It was in this different lighting that we saw the first constructed internal element that wasn't simply structural wall, floor, or ceiling. A kind of low circular pedestal, approximately 1 meter in diameter and 60 centimeters tall. No angular edges, no visible control panel, no recognizable buttons or interfaces. And above it, suspended in air without visible support, a translucent volume. It didn't vibrate, didn't blink, didn't emit audible sound, didn't do anything dramatically obvious. It just seemed to be present, exist. Enrique approached with extreme slowness, maintaining 2 meters safety distance per protocol. Sensors detected minimal electromagnetic field alteration, rose to 31 milligauss, but without detectable ionizing radiation, without measurable electrical charge. Luana tilted her head sideways, observing like someone studying a living organism for the first time without knowing if it's dangerous or harmless. Miguel made a subtle and professional gesture with right hand, indicating for everyone to maintain at least 1.5 meters of preventive distance. I fixed my gaze on the suspended volume. It wasn't projected hologram. There was no characteristic distortion or pixelation. It wasn't solid glass. Light crossed through it inconsistently. It seemed something between dense liquid and solidified gas, but without physical container holding it. Inside it, a sequence of geometric forms continuously reorganized in absolute silence. Smooth curves, straight lines, perfect circles, logarithmic spirals. None of them resembled terrestrial language. None resembled known numerical system. None seemed to want to transmit direct semantic concept. The sensation I had was different. It wasn't message transmission. It wasn't bilateral communication. It wasn't instruction or command. It was registration, documentation, visual cataloging. That structure was capturing our physical presence and transforming it into storable geometric pattern. Enrique murmured on internal radio that the translucent volume visibly reacted to our lateral movement. Internal forms reorganized when we moved, but didn't react to direct frontal approach. Luana observed that internal geometries varied proportionally with our relative distance, as if they were calibrating three-dimensional scale and perspective. Miguel simply marked total exposure time to that specific object. 3 minutes and 40 seconds. I reached a technically simple but existentially disturbing conclusion. That wasn't actively trying to talk to us or instruct us. It was methodically trying to understand what we were as specimen. And now, sitting in this circular chamber where I'm trapped, it's technically obvious that that volume was just the first gesture of recognition and registration. Not the most important in the sequence, just the initial one. We followed down the corridor until it stopped being linear corridor and opened into wide, three-dimensional space. It wasn't exactly closed room. It wasn't industrial warehouse. It was something intermediate and difficult to classify. Large enough for our steps to echo subtly, but not so large we completely lost human scale of reference. The light there was different from the previous section. Colder in color temperature, more precisely measured in distribution. Like professional lighting of Natural Science Museum, except there were no picture frames, and there were no protective glass showcases. There were enclosures. The first had no visible metal bars, no solid opaque walls, no apparent physical barrier blocking access. It was just a circle demarcated on the floor, approximately 3 meters in diameter, in a tone visibly darker than the rest of the surface. Didn't seem like superficially applied paint. Seemed like integrated structural depth. Inside the delimited circle, something moved. Moved the way living organisms move. Not in mathematically straight and predictable line, but with natural hesitation, bodily adjustments, and exploratory behavior. The organism was relatively small, maybe the size of an adult terrestrial rabbit. At least that was the immediate comparative reference my evolutionarily trained brain pulled. an instinctive way to reduce radical strangeness by placing familiar terrestrial similarity. But it definitely wasn't rabbit, not anything remotely close to known terrestrial fauna. The body was elongated and too thin, as if it had been laterally compressed to occupy less spatial volume. The locomotor structures, 4 of them, didn't flex like terrestrial mammal legs. The joints seemed to have inverted biomechanical angles, and the central axial structure, if that was vertebral column, seemed to have too many articulated segments for body size, or too few segments, difficult to visually determine. The external surface, if that was skin or exoskeleton, adjusted malleably over an internal structure that visibly deformed without apparent rigid resistance. But the most technically disturbing thing wasn't the organism itself. It was its behavior in relation to the demarcated circle. The organism didn't leave the circular limit. Not because there was transparent physical barrier blocking. Enrique tested with sensor and detected nothing. But because the organism simply didn't try to leave. As if the spatial limit weren't physically imposed from outside, but psychologically internalized from within. As if the permitted space had been behaviorally learned through conditioning. Enrique verbally recorded that the organism seemed conditioned to remain. Luana technically corrected to spatially domesticated. Miguel, more pragmatic and direct, used another term that stuck in my mind. Exhibited. And that word is technically precise. Because that wasn't visible threat, didn't demonstrate aggressiveness, wasn't wild and unpredictable. It was seen, observed, documented. The exact same type of scene that happens in terrestrial zoological exhibitions, where the animal is present there not to hunt naturally, not to survive in wild habitat, but to be systematically observed by whoever is outside the enclosure. And we were on the outside. We kept walking. The second enclosure was proportionally larger, maybe 5 meters in diameter, but completely empty of any visible organism. Not temporarily empty. Empty in a way that suggested recent permanent absence. The internal surface was slightly darker than surrounding floor, with a discrete matte shine that resembled polished and waxed wood. Enrique measured temperature, minus 62 degrees. Stable. Luana tested reflected light spectrum, limited to specific bands of visible, without ultraviolet or infrared. Miguel kicked foot against enclosure limit. Sound was significantly muffled, like in terrestrial theaters, with intentional acoustic isolation. I stood still a few extra seconds trying to process, until reaching the only functionally sensible logical interpretation. The enclosure was empty now, not because it never had organism occupying, but because something that was there was no longer present. And that was technically worse than occupation. Empty enclosures in collections mean only 2 possibilities: temporary removal to another sector, or specimen death. Neither option was comforting. The third enclosure was the largest so far. So extensive, the upper ceiling visually disappeared in diffuse lighting. The spatial limit wasn't physical and tangible. It was sensory and perceptible. Sight simply couldn't find defined opposite wall. Inside that wide space, there was presence. Body mass. Slow and heavy movement. And continuous low sound. It wasn't a technically defined and recognizable sound. It was almost like deep and rhythmic breathing. That type of low-frequency sound that isn't consciously registered with auditory eardrum, but is viscerally felt with abdominal diaphragm and rib cage. None of us 4 approached closer than 3 meters from that enclosure's limit. Nobody needed to verbalize instruction or command. There, survival instinct functioned technically better than rational protocol. Enrique just objectively noted in voice record that the organism was voluminous. Visual estimate of body mass above 200 kilograms. Luana recorded that the low-frequency sound didn't constitute immediate threat, but was clearly displacement of large mass and controlled movement. Miguel marked his own blood pressure, 123/82. elevated but controllable. I thought something technically simple but conceptually disturbing. If there's enclosure dimensioned for small, medium, and large organism, there's size classification criterion. And if there's clear taxonomic criterion, there's cataloging methodology. And no intelligent structure biologically catalogs without defined functional objective. We proceeded deeper into the structure. From there, the enclosures were no longer spatially isolated from each other. They were architecturally too close, almost sharing dividing walls. Biologically different organisms sharing adjacent space. Clear spatial optimization. Professional curation. Curation is always invisible to visitors, but is technically always present where there's systematic exhibition. In natural history museum, in marine aquarium, in modern terrestrial zoo. Except consciously thinking that word zoo at that moment of exploration seemed premature interpretive exaggeration, and thinking too much is counterproductive in this critical phase of scientific mission. So nobody verbalized anything. The silence between us wasn't social embarrassment. It was accumulated professional prudence. On the right lateral wall of the widened corridor, a perfectly smooth panel subtly illuminated when we passed close. Nothing dramatically flashed. Nothing called aggressive visual attention, just discreetly glowed. The light was yellowish and soft, indicative, recording time and movement with precision. Enrique risked technical interpretation, automatic presence sensors. Miguel deduced function, flow counters. Luana observed disturbing detail. There were 4 light indicators lit in sequence, and a 5th permanently off. I thought different and more specific interpretation. The sensors weren't just detecting generic movement. They were specifically counting us, 4 bipedal organisms, 4 humans, and recording that information. And when something starts systematically counting and cataloging you, the environment technically stops being just strange and unknown. It becomes active biological data collection structure. When we advanced a few more meters, Enrique estimated 17, the widened corridor stopped being corridor once more and transformed into truly open space. It was an environment with multiple enclosures distributed in almost perfectly symmetric form, separated by narrow corridors of 1.2 meters that obliged the visitor to deliberately walk slowly and necessarily look inside each enclosure when passing. That architectural detail only made complete technical sense later. Much later. At the time, my evolutionarily trained brain did what human brains automatically do when confronted with genuinely unknown patterns. Desperately searches for recognizable familiar pattern. Enrique searched for technical and mechanical pattern. Luana searched for geological and natural pattern. Miguel searched for clinical and physiological pattern. I searched for functional and behavioral pattern. The pattern was only one, independent of approach. Organized biologically diverse organisms in systematic taxonomic order. The first row of enclosures seemed functionally dedicated to small, locomotively fast, and sensorially hyperactive organisms. Each enclosure contained constant movement, low-intensity sound, or some type of active and repetitive exploratory behavior. There was no species repetition. Each specimen was biologically unique within the visible set, and if there were multiple specimens of the same species, they weren't stored here in this specific section. This is something only professionally noticed by those who've already worked extensively in comparative biological research laboratories. When scientific interest is purely cellular physiology or genetics, complete population groups are maintained for statistical analysis. When interest is specifically individual behavior or morphological variation, unique individuals are purposely separated. The second row was technically quieter in acoustic terms. There, the cataloged organisms seemed to be of naturally low mobility. Proportionally denser and more compact bodies, deliberately slow movements, visibly wide respiratory pattern with long cycles. Luana took one more calculated step toward that row. taken by the ingrained professional vice of biologically comparing with known terrestrial ecosystems. She'd already done this methodically before, on Earth, with deep ocean crustaceans, with bioluminescent abyssal fish, with things that seem biologically strange and impossible, until environmental context evolutionarily explains them. But there was no interpretive context available there. No identified origin planet, no measurable native gravity, no reconstructible ecological niche. The most technically uncomfortable thing was behavioral silence, not the physical and acoustic silence of sound absence, but the functional silence of the observation system. Nobody visibly present was receiving or monitoring us. No identifiable conscious being, no apparent administrator, no biologically recognizable curator. But professional curation was technically evident in every architectural and organizational observable detail. There was no accumulated dirt, no structural damage, no maintenance failure. Even the enclosures that were temporarily empty were impeccably prepared and functional. Empty but prepared enclosures technically mean expectation of future replacement, mean specimen turnover, mean active collection, not dead archive. Miguel was the first to notice, with that clinical attention trained for subtle behavioral details, that some of these exhibited organisms visibly reacted to our physical presence, but not with territorial aggression, not with exploratory curiosity, not with evolutionary fear of predator. They reacted with passive spatial orientation, turned geometrically, deviated locomotor trajectory, repositioned themselves subtly within demarcated limits. It was technically like watching a terrestrial zoo animal mechanically reacting to strange visitor approaching, but without clear cognitive processing about whether the stranger represents food threat, potential food, or just neutral environmental event. Enrique objectively recorded observable conditioned behavior without apparent positive or negative reinforcement. This is biologically rare and significant. Behaviorally conditioned animals without external reinforcement stimulus don't maintain pattern for much evolutionary time. Behavioral extinction is inevitable, but there the pattern's stably maintained. Technical sign that conditioning was extremely old and deeply consolidated, or genetically internal and hereditary. We methodically followed until reaching what seemed to be the exact geometric center of the internal structure. There was an elevated circular platform, approximately 15 centimeters above surrounding floor level, like a discrete theatrical stage. It was exactly 1.8 meters in diameter, the technically ideal size to comfortably accommodate an adult human body in erect vertical position. That specific detail only hit me cognitively a few minutes later. But when it hit, it was disturbing. The platform material was visibly matte, an apparent mixture of mineral and polymeric composition, with density that didn't proportionally correspond to expected structural weight. Enrique positioned the suit's flashlight beam directly on the surface. The light didn't reflect normally, simply disappeared absorbed. This technically happens with highly absorbent materials like black velvet or aligned carbon nanotubes, but not with this specific type of directional and selective absorption. It was technically manipulated absorption, as if the material deliberately wanted to control incident light, not simply passively swallow it. Miguel clinically commented that elevated platforms with these dimensions and characteristics functionally exist in terrestrial advanced biomechanics institutes, to systematically record body posture and bipedal movement pattern. And it was that apparently innocent phrase that made everything technically fit in my interpretation. That platform wasn't religious altar. It wasn't decorative pedestal. It wasn't command or control station. It was positioning for systematic observation of bipedal organism. Luana took one more calculated step toward the platform, and it was exactly there we saw for the first time a structure that clearly functioned as real physical barrier. It wasn't traditional metal grating. It wasn't solid transparent glass. It wasn't mechanical articulated gate. It was translucent and energetic containment field. A force field. I don't know how else to technically describe, activated at the millimetrically precise instant she crossed an invisible but clearly demarcated alignment on the floor. Nothing dramatically spectacular. Just a vertical barrier of semi-transparent material that produced no audible sound, didn't mechanically vibrate, and didn't visibly threaten. But it was undoubtedly there. Present, functional, blocking. Luana cautiously touched with gloved tip. The field elastically gave approximately 1 centimeter, like very firm and dense gelatin, and immediately returned to original position without residual oscillation. Henrique tried to touch the exact same point. Nothing happened. His hand passed through without resistance. Miguel tried. Nothing. Passed through normally. I personally tried. Nothing. No detectable barrier. Luana tried again. Solid barrier. Total blockage. Individual condition. Personalized selectivity. It wasn't random behavior or technical defect. It was active discrimination based on non-obvious specific criterion, and that, for some deeply instinctive reason, was exponentially more disturbing than any biologically strange organism we'd observed cataloged in adjacent enclosures. Because enclosure is passive and generic containment, but selective barrier is active and individual choice. And if there's technically implemented choice, there's selection criterion, and if there's measurable criterion, someone or something is actively evaluating. And if evaluation is happening in real time, we weren't genuinely alone there for a long time. The energy barrier turned off by itself after exactly 8.3 seconds, according to HUD chronometer. No sound, no indicator light, no prior warning, as if it had never physically been there. Luana instinctively retreated one complete step by pure survival reflex. Henrique didn't verbalize anything on radio, but meticulously noted. He always noted absolutely everything, even when he didn't technically understand what that meant. It was good professional vice, science fundamentally born from obsessive stubbornness before born from rigorous method. Miguel clinically observed the exact time the barrier was active. Extremely short. Less than 10 seconds. Precise and efficient temporal evaluation. I just thought the technically simplest and most direct question: what exactly did they want to measure with that test? The philosophical problem of the genuinely unknown is that human brain always tries to force anthropocentric translation. If it can't understand clear intention, tries to understand basic function. If doesn't understand function, tries to understand at least measurable consequence. And there, at that specific moment, none of the three approaches provided satisfactory answer. We cautiously followed a few more meters, maybe 9 or 10, until the floor subtly changed. It was the same base material, same surface texture, same temperature of -62 degrees, but with a geometrically subtle incline that I only noticed when my internal vestibular balance axis began to unconsciously complain. The incline wasn't structural error or construction flaw. It was intentional behavioral stimulus. Biomedical specialists in human gait use subtle inclined ramps to evaluate automatic postural adjustments. Terrestrial museums use discrete floor inclines to unconsciously control visitor flow. Modern zoos use imperceptible differences in level to guide animal behavior without obvious physical containment. When I finally consciously noticed this, everything became technically clearer and simultaneously more deeply uncomfortable. We weren't just walking exploratorily, we were being subtly directed and guided. Henrique reached the same technical interpretation, but articulated more technically elegantly. He murmured on internal radio with controlled voice, "The architectural space is actively conversing with us." It wasn't poetic metaphor. It was precise technical description. After the subtle incline, we found proportionally larger enclosures. And in these expanded spaces, the cataloged organisms were biologically different in more radical form. The first moved with a slowness so absolutely calm, it seemed almost photosynthetic plant organism. 3 visibly articulated body segments, matte external surface without shine, extremely discreet, almost imperceptible breathing, and sensory structures. Eyes maybe, or something functionally equivalent. In excessive number, or insufficient, depending on observation angle and lighting. The second organism was behaviorally opposite, extremely fast, bodily light, with locomotor appendages capable of generating absurd rotational torque without losing structural balance. When it sensorially detected us approaching, didn't flee with fear. Just rotated entire body until perfectly aligning main visual axis, assuming those structures were visual organs, with our observation axis. No attack, no detectable fear, no apparent genuine interest. It was simply mutual bilateral and neutral observation. The third enclosure of this section was completely empty. And again, that was technically worse than any active occupation. The fourth contained organism that didn't detectably move. Not because it was biologically dead or inactive, but because active locomotion simply wasn't part of that specific species' evolutionary behavioral repertoire. It was completely static. Not by physical limitation, but by adaptive behavioral strategy. Sequential enclosures with evolutionarily so radically diverse behaviors, positioned side by side in deliberate proximity, strongly suggested clear intention of comparative demonstration. Not for isolated pure research, but for systematic taxonomic comparison. Comparing is fundamentally activity of those who exhibit collections. Those who scientifically research compare to conclude hypotheses. Those who professionally exhibit compare to demonstrate diversity. That's when we reached the first environment that technically wasn't containment enclosure. It was a wide spatial cube, approximately 6 meters per side, containing a single structural pillar in exact geometric center. The pillar was approximately 2 meters tall, compatible with tall adult human, with perfectly clear and uniform surface, without any visible decorative or functional adornment. The absolute absence of surface detail was the technically most significant detail. Miguel methodically approached slowly and formulated the most objective and dry clinical hypothesis of the environment so far. Taxonomic triage. The word fell heavy in radio silence. Triage is fundamentally pragmatic process. Triage possesses no emotional component. Triage selects based on pre-established criterion. Enrique didn't technically disagree. Luana didn't contest the interpretation. I personally didn't like the conclusion, but couldn't formulate more plausible alternative. Triage necessarily implies that functional criterion exists before selection action. And if well-defined selection criterion exists, the criterion definitely wasn't established by us. The pillar illuminated, not with direct and pointed light, with a diffuse halo. The halo completely enveloped the pillar in a perfectly uniform translucent layer that subtly oscillated like thermal distortion above heated terrestrial asphalt. The oscillation was extremely smooth, but possessed detectable rhythm. Rhythm is always technical sign of active analysis process. Luana was the first to notice the crucial detail. The luminous halo technically wasn't analyzing the structural pillar itself. It was specifically analyzing us four reflected in the perfectly smooth surface of the pillar. The structure didn't want to catalog what the pillar was. It wanted to measure and systematically document what we were in dimensional and behavioral relation to the pillar. This is fundamentally taxonomic triage. This is comparative biological cataloging methodology. It was at that specific time I finally understood something technically subtle but definitive. It doesn't make functional sense to triage an organism biologically outside its natural environmental context. If you want to scientifically understand a bipedal organism, you necessarily analyze it in characteristic vertical position. Therefore, the pillar possessed adult human height for clear technical reason, not by random statistical coincidence. And it was exactly there the discomfort transformed into partial but growing certainty. That entire structure wasn't simply generically examining the scientific mission. It was specifically examining the species, Homo sapiens, cataloging, documenting, archiving. When the luminous halo finally went out after 23 seconds, the floor vibrated discreetly. Not like natural tectonic tremor, but like intentional and controlled warning. And only after the vibration completely ended, we noticed Henrique was no longer physically with us. Nobody heard sound of step moving away. Nobody heard mechanical door closing. Nobody heard cry of surprise or call for help. Just sudden absence. Luana called on internal radio. Silence. Miguel checked thermal signal on sensor. Nothing detectable. I searched for recent movement pattern on floor. Nothing. Just complete absence. It wasn't voluntary escape. It wasn't death by suit failure. It was deliberate and efficient removal. And removal without audible sound isn't aggressive attack. It's professional logistics. It's procedure. It's protocol. And logistical protocol is always technically worse than chaotic violence. Enrique's absence arrived psychologically before conscious fear. This is the aspect that most technically disturbs me when I remember. There was no immediate explosive panic, no desperate running. Just dense and heavy silence. Like when someone closes a book exactly halfway and the rest of the narrative stays indefinitely suspended in air. Luana called again on radio, but it wasn't genuine call to reunite. It was call to confirm perception, as if she technically wanted to know if her own sensory interpretation was correct. Miguel took exactly 3 measured steps in opposite direction. He wasn't actively searching for Henrique. Searched for residual physical mark, floor drag, thermal alteration, structural modification. Absolutely nothing detectable. The floor remained identical. Cold at -62 degrees, uniform, absorbing light, without returning history or evidence. I just thought the technically simplest and most direct question, the one nobody likes to formulate too early in scientific mission. If they removed Henrique first, why specifically him? Selection criterion is never random in complex systems. Intelligent organisms don't do absolutely anything without measurable purpose, even when purpose is completely invisible to external observer. We advanced because staying statically still also offered no tactical or scientific advantage. The architectural structure changed again so gradually we only noticed retrospectively. Before, enclosures were arranged in geometric alignment. Now, they were functionally organized in thematic sectors. Sector of small organisms under 10 kilograms. Sector of medium organisms between 10 and 100 kilograms. Sector of large organisms above 100 kilograms. Sector of statically immobile organisms. Sector of empty enclosures awaiting occupation. Spatial distribution didn't follow known terrestrial biological logic. Not ecological, not comparative anatomical. It was completely other taxonomy. A classification we didn't recognize, because it wasn't based on terrestrial evolutionary criteria. Luana stopped abruptly before a proportionally enormous enclosure. That type where sight doesn't reach the back even with adequate lighting. Inside, there was extremely slow movement, and no perceptible sound even with maximum amplification of suit audio system. Miguel touched his own facial mask visor, as if wanting to clean condensation that didn't exist. The problem wasn't the visor, it was brain processing. When evolutionarily trained brain can't interpret observed form, it desperately tries to invent recognizable pattern. Invented nothing useful. I deliberately preferred not to observe that specific enclosure too much. When we finally reached what seemed to be the geometric center of that expanded sector, the structure executed something technically new. It spatially isolated us. Not with dramatic light, not with alarm sound, not with physical impact, with subtle architectural reconfiguration. The walls, if those mobile elements were technically walls, created a narrow corridor of 1.1 meters in front, blocking progression. An open triangular space behind, allowing retreat. and a perfectly delimited circle in center with 3.2 meters diameter where we were positioned. It was too fast to be random structural coincidence, and too smooth to be immediate aggressive threat. Space now possessed absolutely clear architectural intention to specifically position us. Taxonomic triage isn't just passively measuring. Triage is actively classifying based on criterion. It was at that time Miguel instinctively looked up. There was no visible solid ceiling. There was just indefinite height. This technical difference only functionally exists in observation aquariums and containment cages. Before that moment, I would have interpretively thought advanced scientific research complex. At that specific second, I objectively thought biological exposition facility. And the most technically disturbing aspect, nobody was visibly watching, at least not in obvious and detectable form. Luana's removal happened without any detectable prior warning. This time it wasn't absolute silence. There was sound of step. Luana took a single calculated step forward to better observe one of the lateral enclosures. When the suited foot touched the floor, it sank millimeters too much. Maybe 3 millimeters beyond normal. The material shouldn't yield like that. The translucent containment field activated instantly. Not by elapsed time. Not by thermal heating. Not by random and casual movement. By deliberate decision of intelligent structure. I desperately tried to pull her by suit arm. Miguel tried to grab her by waist with force. But there was no measurable hydraulic resistance, no opposing mechanical force, no detectable physical traction. It was technically like trying to pull someone out of deep dream. The body partially came, but the person remained, the field completely closed. Didn't violently crush, didn't cut, just isolated with efficiency. For exactly 3 measured seconds, we could see Luana visibly behind a translucent barrier that physically shouldn't exist. On the 4th timed second, the field completely went out, and Luana was no longer there. No residual sound, no remaining light, no indication of pain. Just technical absence. Miguel looked at me with that specific type of look extremely rational and trained people make, when they understand pure rationality no longer serves as useful tool. I didn't verbalize anything, but thought exactly the same thing as before. If Luana was removed as second, what technically is the selection order? And if measurable order exists, clear taxonomic criterion exists, and if cataloging criterion exists, someone is systematically recording. And if recording is happening, someone eventually exhibits. Just me and Miguel remained, 2 of 4. It's technically curious how absence fundamentally changes a place's environment. Doesn't alter physical temperature, doesn't alter atmospheric pressure, doesn't alter oxygen composition, but changes absolutely everything that really psychologically matters. Miguel visibly breathed faster than his pattern. It wasn't lack of air in suit, it was accelerated heart rate. Rhythm is always the first physiological indicator of growing fear in professionally trained people. The autonomic body gets ahead long before conscious mind finally admits. I methodically looked around trying to find architectural logic. Nothing there seemed genuinely random. Nothing seemed structural improvisation. Nothing seemed abandonment or neglect. Genuinely intelligent structures do preventive maintenance. Biologically living structures do adaptive adjustment. That place technically executed both simultaneously. The blocked corridor ahead progressively became clearer. Not because it gained more absolute illumination, but because it gained intentional visual direction. The floor formed a guideline, a subtle trace approximately 5 centimeters lighter than rest of surface, inexorably conducting gaze forward. Terrestrial spaceships do this with narrow emergency corridors. Modern museums do with visual trails. Contemporary zoos do with rigorously controlled visitor flow. I followed. Miguel also followed immediately. Not because it was technically correct, but because remaining still was psychologically worse. We walked approximately 42 meters, Enrique would have measured with exact precision. Time ceases to be a useful unit when space possesses clear architectural intention. The corridor opened once more. But now, not in multiple enclosures of biologically diverse species. It was a single enclosure, proportionally large, perfectly circular, geometrically symmetric, and completely empty of any organism. No cataloged animal, no environmental noise, no detectable odor, just prepared space, waiting. Miguel cautiously approached geometric center. The floor had a clearly marked circle, not superficially drawn, structurally marked, as if material mechanically remembered old applied pressure. Enrique would fit perfectly inside there. Luana too. Miguel likewise. I certainly would. It wasn't statistical projection. It was precise dimensional mold for adult Homo sapiens. When Miguel finally positioned foot inside demarcated circle, the enclosure immediately reacted. Not with containment field. Not with translucent barrier. Not with gas or radiation. Not with dramatic light. It reacted with systematic observation. Something in ceiling, or technically above ceiling, or in architectural space where structural ceiling should logically be, instantly created a perfect cone of extremely clean and sharp white light. It didn't casually illuminate Miguel. It systematically measured Miguel. The light methodically traveled body axis, total height, vertebral posture, proportional weight distribution, respiratory pattern, voluntary muscle control. Biomechanical triage sensors from advanced terrestrial medical centers execute functionally similar procedure, but never ever with this millimetric precision and temporal efficiency. Miguel instinctively did what humans evolutionarily do when they feel they're being actively evaluated. Automatically straightened posture. Tried to stay behaviorally neutral. Tried to seem physiologically healthy. Its instinctive response. Purely animal. Millions of years of social evolution. After exactly 3.7 measured seconds, the light abruptly went out. The floor sank the same characteristic millimeters. Same sinking that preceded Luana's removal. Same that probably preceded Enrique. Miguel technically understood before me. He looked at me, but not like someone asking for desperate help, or like someone emotionally saying goodbye. Looked like someone accepting scientific experiment result. The translucent containment field descended from above with almost delicate smoothness. There was no mechanical haste, no violence, just efficient and inevitable decision. I ran to field edge and desperately touched. Material elastically gave 1 exact centimeter, identical to previous times, and perfectly returned. Miguel didn't verbalize anything final. Neither could I. What was there genuinely to say? The field smoothly rose, and Miguel disappeared without sound. Without technical failure, without human error, absolutely perfect removal. That was the exact psychological moment I finally understood it wasn't scientific mission. It wasn't disaster. It wasn't diplomatic contact. It was systematic taxonomic cataloging. And if professional biological cataloging exists, there necessarily exists specific sector for humans. The sector was empty until then. Now it wasn't anymore. I didn't have fear of dying at that instant. I had fear of something technically stranger and more disturbing. Fear of being permanently classified. When I finally turned around, the enclosure fundamentally altered. Architectural walls disappeared. Lateral enclosures vanished. Corridor dissolved. Just the demarcated circle, uniform floor, and me remained. I don't know how much chronological time I stood there. I don't know if time functionally mattered. The second I finally thought about physically retreating, the containment field descended, but it didn't descend to remove me like the others. It descended to isolate and catalog me. There was no dramatic light, no alarm sound. Just a small thermal deviation detected in suit visor, indicating environment was now hermetically closed. Suit automatically responded, signaling stable pressure at 4.9 kilopascals, stable temperature at -57 degrees, and internally maintained breathable composition. This allowed me to think one thing that, technically, I already knew. They didn't place me there to die. They specifically placed me there to be systematically observed, and that is incomparably worse. I didn't visibly see anyone, didn't hear anyone, didn't feel physical presence of anyone. But the sensation of being actively seen arrived long before any concrete evidence. It's a specific type of psychological discomfort that doesn't born from predator fear, but from consciousness of being object. Animals in zoo cages feel exactly like this. Not when predator threateningly approaches, but when observer stops studying. The field around me didn't alter light, temperature, or pressure. Just technically excluded the rest of external world. What remained was architectural stage, and me positioned. After a few seconds, or maybe minutes, time lost meaning. The structure changed environment with precision of modern interactive museum. Floor gradually darkened, not to erase, but to highlight by contrast. Suit proportionally reflected more light. Silhouette became more sharply marked. Respiratory pattern became visibly evident to any sensor or visual organ observing from other side. I deliberately didn't look up. I can't technically explain the reason. Maybe because evolutionary prey instinct avoids recognizing audience. Ceiling gained detectable movement. Weren't mechanical doors, weren't glass windows, weren't conventional openings. Were observation channels. Light that finally entered didn't have recognizable human color temperature. Wasn't white, yellow, nor terrestrial blue. Was light that actively observes, not that passively illuminates. It divided into 3 distinct beams, each with different geometric angle, each with different temporal duration. That's how I finally understood complete function. It wasn't just cataloging an isolated human. It was systematically comparing a human with other humans who'd already been there before. Henrique, Luana, Miguel. I didn't need to see to know with certainty. Taxonomic cages are never built for just one isolated organism. Never are. When analytical light ended, came smaller but significant environmental adjustments. Subtle change of internal ventilation, air density displacement, minimal relative humidity alteration. This isn't done for dramatic impact. This is done for long-term preservation. Terrestrial zoos execute exactly this with physiologically sensitive mammals. Meticulously control microclimate, which preserves animal healthy for prolonged exhibition. When I finally consciously noticed this, a very simple thought formed. They didn't want me to die quickly. Professionally cataloged animals aren't eliminated. They're systematically maintained. Genuine horror wasn't in imminent death. It was in indefinite continuity. I don't know how long I've been in this chamber. The suit says oxygen remains stable, that temperature is controlled, that I'm technically alive. But alive doesn't mean free. Sometimes I see movement above the dome. Sometimes light subtly changes angle. Sometimes I feel they're measuring something in me I don't know how to name. Henrique, Luana, Miguel, I don't know where they are, if they're in adjacent chambers, if they're in another sector, if they're still conscious. I just know we're 4 specimens of Homo sapiens, cataloged, archived, preserved. NASA never prepared us for this, and to be technically fair, there was no way to prepare. There's no manual for when the universe doesn't want to converse. Just document. If someone finds this recording, understand, we weren't attacked. We weren't killed. We weren't tortured. We were classified. And classification, I discovered, is much worse than extinction. Because extinction is end. Classification is permanence without own purpose. We're now what we always feared being, not the observers of cosmos, but specimens in someone's collection. The zoo is real, and we're inside it.